Just east of San Francisco's Golden Gate Park is a neighborhood known as the Haight-Ashbury. Haight Street runs pretty much east-west, dead ending at Golden Gate Park. The north-south Ashbury Street intersects Haight Street near the middle of the district. The Haight-Ashbury is a neighborhood of houses that were formerly expensive Victorian mansions built in the teens. But with time, the district's formerly splendid houses had become a shabby, run-down, hole-in-the-wall area, and by the early 1960s, one could find ornate mansions for rent as cheap as a few $100s a month. Some of the beatniks that had formerly resided in the North Beach district started finding their way to the new hip neighborhood. With time, the population within the Haight-Ashbury grew to include folkies, beatniks, hippies, diggers, and members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. The folkies were a small enclave of musicians and fans of American folk music. The beatniks were the most important predecessors of the hippies. Like the beatniks, the hippies were disillusioned with the conformity of American life and embraced an anti-establishment attitude which included smoking marijuana and exploring Eastern mysticism. But the most important catalyst that drove the schism between the Beats and the hippies was the Psychedelic Revolution, which divided them into the aware and the rest. Where the Beats' musical genre had been jazz, the hippies gravitated towards rock and roll. Where the beatniks embraced a philosophy of nihilism, seeking escape in a meaningless culture, the hippies were far more optimistic, striving towards some kind of positive change, either within themselves or in society at large. Within the Haight, an organization known as the Diggers spontaneously came into existence. They astounded local inhabitants, critical squares, and the press by providing free services. They opened several free stores in and around the Haight, offering discarded and donated items for free. As the throngs of homeless grew, they organized a free food service in the panhandle of Golden Gate Park. Every day at 4 p.m., they would produce garbage can stew and feed about 100 people with a soup made from donated meat and vegetables. They worked with local churches to provide crash pads for the multitude of homeless youth. They also opened a much-needed free medical clinic, manned by volunteers from University of California, San Francisco Medical School. The free food, housing, and medical were effectively addressing social issues that the local municipal government was completely ignoring. The press labeled them as a sort of hip Salvation Army. Though far more dissident than the press understood, the Diggers would become an important presence in the Haight-Ashbury. The Hells Angels Motorcycle Club may seem like an unlikely ally of the hippies, but they were. The main thing that the Angels had in common with the hippies was that they were outlaws. The Angels were a self-described outlaw motorcycle gang, though most hippies did not ride motorcycles, and most definitely did not identify with any of the violence that was linked to the Angels. They did see themselves as outlaws by the mere fact that they smoked marijuana. The Hells Angels were a very visible presence in the Haight-Ashbury. The hippies and the Angels would have a peaceful marriage that lasted a few years but ended in tragedy with an ugly, irreconcilable separation. Though it would be inaccurate to assert that every folkie, beatnik, and hippie smoked marijuana, it is very reasonable to speculate that most did. The mere fact that members of these subcultures were willing to join the semi-secret society of marijuana smokers meant that they were willing to break the law, and the real currency of the Haight-Ashbury was drugs. But to the hippies, the word drugs no longer meant inebriation, it meant enlightenment. Millions of high school kids across the nation wanted to get some beer after the game and get falling down drunk. Millions of blue-collar workers wanted to have some drinks after work and escape their humdrum lives. Millions of businessmen were anticipating a three-martini lunch. Millions of housewives were addicted to tranquilizers so they could escape the mundaneness of their day-to-day lives. Alcohol was hardly a drug of enlightenment, but truly one of escape. The hippies of the psychedelic revolution, in contrast, weren't interested in dumbing themselves down to escape an intolerable world. They were focused on raising themselves up to a better state of awareness, both of the self and of the world around them. With time, the Haight-Ashbury became a virtual carnival atmosphere with hippies selling drugs on every street corner. In the earliest days of the Haight-Ashbury, it was almost like an Eastern ashram. Enlightened young bohemians immersed into a small community, taking on the therapeutic atmosphere of open-minded ideas, good vibes, and psychedelic drugs. And in this hotbed of drug-fueled self-awareness came ideas about how a culture might be more rewarding for the individual, society as a whole, and even for the planet. Though the hippies were almost all in their 20s and most likely too young and naive to have realistic solutions, those ideas that came out of the hippie psychedelic revolution would resonate down through the generations. Merchants within the Haight-Ashbury started expanding into new markets. The first business of note was the Psychedelic Shop. Located at 1535 Haight Street, it specialized in all things catering to the new psychedelic movement. Psilocybin mushrooms, peyote buttons, mescaline, and LSD were all still legal at the time, but not widely available. The Psychedelic Shop did not sell drugs, but it did sell the accoutrements of the clientele who used them. Colored lights, strobe lights, posters, and esoteric books were their main offerings. The Weed Patch sold papers and pipes. Illegal to sell marijuana, but not illegal to sell the pipes, papers, and hookahs used to smoke with, the Weed Patch was one of the very first drug paraphernalia stores in the United States. One could find funky hippie clothing at the Blushing Peony, psychedelic posters at the Print Mint, and a favorite hangout was Quasar's ice cream store. Not initially, but with time, there would be a variety of concert halls like the Fillmore and the Avalon Ballroom, catering to the up-and-coming bands playing the new San Francisco sound. Many important musicians and rock bands that went on to lasting fame lived in or near the Haight-Ashbury in the mid-1960s. Janis Joplin lived at 635 Ashbury Street. The Grateful Dead lived at 710 Ashbury Street. Soon after their record deal, the Jefferson Airplane purchased a mansion at 2400 Fulton, known as the Airplane House. Both Quicksilver Messenger Service and the Steve Miller Band were San Francisco residents. Both Carlos Santana and Sly and the Family Stone lived within miles of the Haight-Ashbury. Country Joe and the Fish were just over the Bay Bridge in nearby Berkeley, and Creedence Clearwater Revival lived just minutes north of Berkeley in El Cerrito, California. During the height of the hippie era, within several minutes' drive of the Haight-Ashbury, several important music venues came and went. Music impresario Bill Graham's first significant hall was the Fillmore, located at 1805 Geary Boulevard, followed by the Fillmore West at 10 South Van Ness Avenue, and eventually the Winterland Ballroom at 2000 Post Street. Chet Helms opened the Avalon Ballroom, located at 1268 Sutter Street. Hippies from the Haight-Ashbury frequented these venues to see their favorite rock bands playing the new San Francisco sound. There were a series of significant events that took place during the height of the Haight-Ashbury period. The first was advertised as The Family Dog Presents a Tribute to Dr. Strange. held on Saturday, October 16th, 1965, at the Longshoremen's Hall in San Francisco Fisherman's Wharf area. The flyer called it a rock and roll dance and concert and announced four bands: the Charlatans, the Marbles, the Great Society, and the Jefferson Airplane. The newly emerging hippie culture arrived dressed in their trend setting garb of the time. Men were dressed like riverboat gamblers, mountain men in buckskins, and desperados in black leather. Women wore their hair long and straight and sported vintage long dresses and brightly colored scarfs and boas. The concert was accompanied by a light show, like most audience members had never seen before, with swirling colored lights and projections that pulsated to the music. Between the music, the lights, and the effects of LSD, the crowd was dancing wildly. By the time Jefferson Airplane hit their stride, there were about 30 people holding hands and dancing in a circle. Paul Kantner later recalled that every show prior to that one, they were the band on the stage and everyone else was the audience on the floor. But something new had taken place that night, and the band and the crowd and the music all fused into one thing. Respected author and LSD advocate Ken Kesey and his group of merry pranksters had held four of their acid tests in small towns outside of San Francisco in late 1965. Then, on January 8, 1966, they held the first acid test event at the Fillmore Auditorium. The posters usually contained the question, "Can you pass the acid test?" Underground chemist Augustus Stanley Owsley III provided the LSD. The Grateful Dead performed at most events accompanied by psychedelic light shows, which were a new visual enhancement of the time. The event, the LSD, and the musical performances were all free of charge to those attending. Ken Kesey was attempting to create a new art form that was a total experience, with all the senses opened wide: words, music, lights, sounds, touch lightning. Just 2 weeks later was an event advertised as Trips Festival 1966, held over a 3-day weekend, January 21, 22, 23, 1966, at the Longshoremen's Hall. It was a festival of sights and sounds. Exhibits, movies, soundtracks, light shows, projections, and the Merry Pranksters acid test. Music was provided by The Loading Zone, Big Brother and the Holding Company, and the Grateful Dead. An estimated 10,000 people purchased the $5 tickets for the 3-day event. There were 5 movie projectors going, countless light machines sweeping the hall. The Grateful Dead had 10 speakers encircling the balcony. There were strobe lights, black lights, and day-glow paint available for attendees to use. Some women had removed their tops and were exposing their half-nude bodies. In the center were the Merry Pranksters with their mics and speakers. Later, Jerry Garcia, lead guitarist from the Grateful Dead, said, "It was total insanity. I mean, total, wall-to-wall gonzo lunacy. Everybody was just partying furiously. There were people jumping off balconies into blankets and then bouncing up and down. I mean, there was incredible shit going on. Plus, it was like old home week. I met and saw everybody I had ever known, every beatnik, every hippie, every coffee house hangout person from all over the state was there, all freshly psychedelicized." For the hippie community, the Trips Festival was the first open convention of acid heads that had previously been strictly an underground movement, and they were amazed at how big their clandestine tribe had grown. More than any other single event, the Trips Festival was why the population of the Haight-Ashbury exploded in early 1966, though it would be inaccurate to say there was one event that was the catalyst. The Trips Festival had been like throwing a switch that sent a surge of energy through the isolated pockets of hippies in various parts of the Bay Area. In the course of a few months, Kesey and his merry pranksters managed to introduce more people to LSD than all of the professional researchers, Sandoz Laboratories, and Timothy Leary combined. San Francisco's hip masses came to the Trips Festival with their emerging identities already developing, but after the festival, they were on the path to becoming Haight-Ashbury's new hippie community. In late September, Stuart Brand, who had promoted the Trips Festival, organized the Awareness Festival, also advertised as Whatever It Is, held September 30th and October 1st and 2nd, 1966, at San Francisco State College. A bandstand was erected in the center of the school gymnasium. Film projectors showed Technicolor movies against the ceiling. The Grateful Dead performed with oscillating light machines projecting their rainbow of colors swirling around the room. The music, lights, and revelry went on until about 4 o'clock in the morning. Just a few days after the Awareness Festival, on October 6, 1966, the California State Legislature passed a law which criminalized the possession of LSD. On October 7, the day after the bill took effect, a group of pro-LSD hippies went to San Francisco's City Hall. They brought gifts of morning glory seeds and store-bought mushrooms, hoping to expand the consciousness of Mayor John F. Shelley. They were in the middle of their presentation, which was equal parts legitimate protest and media bullshit, when anti-war activist Jerry Rubin showed up to hold his own press conference. The ensuing scene was emblematic of the turmoil of the 1960s, with the activists in their work boots and dungarees on one side, and the flower children in their robes and love beads on the other. The hippies were the contemplative types who were looking within for some kind of enlightenment, and the activists were taking to the streets and voicing their opinions about the evils of racism, imperialism, and the war. To the activists, it was bewildering that their educated brethren were flocking to the hippies' ranks, but they were, and in growing numbers every day. By the time LSD was finally made illegal, an occasion recognized in San Francisco by a huge drug-fueled party in Golden Gate Park that featured several of the Bay Area's top bands, there was enough LSD already produced and in circulation to keep the exploding hippie population tripping for years to come. Weeks later came the acid test graduation. Scheduled for October 31, 1966, it was to be held at Bill Graham's new Winterland Ballroom. Ken Kesey had spread the word that he was going to spike the water supply of Winterland with LSD, but when promoter Bill Graham heard the rumor, he canceled the show. At the last minute, the pranksters rented a warehouse on Harriet Street. On the night of the event, many disgruntled patrons were turned away from the door at Winterland, but a few found their way to the warehouse. The pranksters' psychedelically painted bus Further sported a 15-foot banner that read Acid Test Graduation. Ken Kesey took center stage, and Neil Cassidy announced the names of those who graduated the acid test. Most were members of the Merry Pranksters, but even Hell's Angel Alan Gut Turk received a diploma. There was no band that night because after Graham canceled the show, the Grateful Dead had been booked for a different event across town. Compared to most of the acid tests and other LSD-fueled events, the graduation was tame. On New Year's Day, 1967, began one of the most eventful years in rock and roll history, when the Hells Angels promoted an event known as the New Year's Whale. Hippies from across the Haight thronged to the Golden Gate Park's Panhandle area to attend a free concert. The Hells Angels paid the tab, including free beer and for the bands The Grateful Dead and Janis Joplin and Big Brother and the Holding Company. It was the first large-scale free rock concert in any city park in America. It was a mind-boggling sight. The feared outlaws drinking and dancing with hundreds of mystical acid heads in foggy San Francisco Park. The day after the performance, Janis Joplin wrote to her parents, "Played a hippie party in Golden Gate Park yesterday, co-sponsored by the Hells Angels who, at least in San Francisco, are really nice. They have a different social code, but it seems to be inner-directed, and they don't try and impose it on anyone." Around this same time, several members of the Hells Angels moved into a house directly across the street from the Grateful Dead's house at 710 Ashbury Street. 2 weeks later was the powwow, a gathering of the tribes for a human be-in, held on Saturday, January 14, 1967, at the Polo Grounds of Golden Gate Park. Though some hippies were predicting a population explosion would take place in the Haight-Ashbury during the summer of 1967, no one really understood what was about to begin. And though the phrase wouldn't be coined until many months later, in retrospect, it is easy to see that the Summer of Love actually began in January of 1967. Compared to the Angels' much smaller gathering on New Year's Day, the Be-In was the first event that brought together a significant number of people from the Haight and beyond. For many in attendance, it was an awakening to the fact that their numbers had grown so large. It is estimated that between 20,000 to 40,000 people attended the celebration. The Be-In was to be a cross-section of counterculture celebrities, psychedelic gurus, beat poets, rock bands, and political activists. The bands that played were the Quicksilver Messenger Service, the Grateful Dead, and the Jefferson Airplane. Up until that time, the Be-In was the largest assembly of the various factions of the counterculture ever to take place. Psychedelic advocates, beat poets, political activists, Hells Angels, and hippies were grooving to the music for 4 to 5 hours straight. The Be-In received national media coverage, sending the message that San Francisco was a groovy place to be, telling would-be hippies everywhere to find their way to the Haight-Ashbury. They came in droves and created the soon-to-be-called Summer of Love. When the press started sensationalizing the Haight-Ashbury, their articles were like advertisements for the neighborhood, but not the kind of ads that hippies hoped to see. The articles dwelt on free love, free food, and a community that embraced nonconformists. The result was an influx of hippies encompassing the whole spectrum of nonconformity. It wasn't just competent visionaries, but also insecure misfits, dysfunctional dropouts, and outcast crazies. The formerly bohemian Haight-Ashbury became polluted with the marginalized youth of America. It devolved into a social swamp of directionless youths whose primary focuses were the thrill of drugs and the abandonment of middle-class responsibilities. When idealism began to erode, the various support systems began to dwindle or disappear. With the population exploding and the support teams overwhelmed, free food in the panhandle became infrequent. The free crash pads supplied by the diggers had been repeatedly raided by the police and subsequently abandoned. Drug dealing, which had been the original economic base of the community, had found its way into fewer and fewer hands until it was controlled by a very savvy and organized cartel. The only thing new happening in the Summer of Love was the free concerts in the Panhandle and the very much needed free medical clinic. By June of 1966, an estimated 15,000 hippies were living in the Haight-Ashbury, a population explosion that was as mysterious to the local hippies as it was to everyone else. God had fingered that little block system between Baker and Stanton Street, and we spent all our time verbally and non-verbally trying to discover why. As word spread, thousands of young people made pilgrimages to the Haight to see for themselves. Local high school students took public buses for the short trip across town. College students from the greater Bay Area showed up on weekends. High school dropouts, runaways, and drifters came from far and wide, hoping that the songs on the radio about people with flowers in their hair and warm San Franciscan nights were actually true. Many a naive child seeking a utopian ideal where love, sex, and drugs flowed freely were by and large completely disappointed. Only the most adept opportunists that knew how to work the system and find a hustle were able to survive and possibly even thrive. But the allure of the promise of this new Bohemia was powerful enough to draw the multitudes from far and wide. Across the nation, there was an ever growing new generation of youngsters who had heard of the new mind drugs and were determined to find the source. And they were also interested in the books, art, psychology, and exotic religions that went hand in hand with the new counterculture. The area that was formerly the Haight Street's middle class shopping district now looked like a walking circus. These young bohemians talked a good line of finding themselves or being themselves, but they wore costumes reflecting a multitude of formerly established identities like cowboys, Indians, and bikers, donning granny dresses and serapes. And everywhere on the street one heard the street dealer's softly murmured mantra of acid, grass, hash, acid, grass, hash. It didn't take long for the Haight-Ashbury to draw national attention as a cultural curiosity, and on the heels of national attention came the journalists, historians, and sociologists. One sociologist likened the Haight to the delta of a river where the sediments of America were collecting, but few could pinpoint why so many young people were coming from so many different destinations to this previously insignificant neighborhood. When interviewers asked the young hippies why they came to the Haight, they frequently received cryptic responses like, I fell in with some vibrational energies and ended up here. Among the hippies that were flowing into the Haight, some were lost youths struggling to survive. Some were entrepreneurs thriving on the new markets. Some were visionaries bringing their own brand of art or hope to the new community. And some were the politicos hoping to ignite a revolution or at least bring about some margin of change. Many idealistic artists felt that the birth of the Haight was heralding the end of the machine age and a return to the Garden of Eden. The politicos had goals that ranged from overt to clandestine, from bringing more awareness and speaking out directly against the war in Vietnam to more subtle goals like finding out if the hippies might be the base for the new left. But for many young kids, the Haight-Ashbury was a desperate and struggling existence. With 1967's Summer of Love turning into the fall of Something Else, the Diggers announced a march to be held on Haight Street called the Death of Hippie Ceremony, complete with an oversized empty coffin and pallbearers. The mock funeral was to represent the end of the social experiment that had taken place in the Haight-Ashbury, in some small hope to close the door on that chapter and to stem the tide of pilgrims still flowing into San Francisco. They printed a flyer that read, Funeral Notice, Hippie, in Haight-Ashbury district of this city. Hippie, devoted son of mass media. Friends are invited to attend service beginning at sunrise, October 6, 1967, at Buena Vista Park. The leaders carried the mock coffin east on Haight Street while a bugler played taps, and they buried the coffin in Buena Vista Park. Their goal was to stop the commercialization of the hippie lifestyle and media appropriation of the social experiment. Though it did garner attention on the national news, it had little impact on the flood of youths coming to the Haight-Ashbury. After the death of Hippie, the Diggers vacated their headquarters and were never collectively impactful again. The initial people who had coalesced into the Haight-Ashbury were visionaries trying to create a positive social experiment, but unfortunately it collapsed into an ugly milieu of methadone, heroin, and aggressive crime. With every passing week, things got a little bit scarier and a little more out of control. A community that had started as peace, love, and flowers was devolving into a survival of the fittest concrete jungle. By the summer of 1967, the avant garde businesses had closed their doors. The original free clinic had closed, and the Haight Ashbury came crashing down under the weight of its own population explosion. Some of the older hippies were under the false impression that the newcomers would automatically tune into the same trip of peace and love, but many of the youngsters had come from completely different social environments than the original hippies and were focused on cheap thrills with little interest in social responsibility. The newcomers didn't create the revolutionary community, they merely joined an established populace where they mimicked the costume, language, and outward behavior frequently without the foundational experiences that the initial hippies had. Many of the newcomers had no interest in issues like the war in Vietnam or social reform. They just wanted to look cool, talk cool, and do as many drugs as possible. In its last days, the hate was descended upon by sociologists, journalists, modern day gurus, and opportunistic criminals, usually driven by goals of self interest, with a vast population of young, naive, pseudo hippies to prey upon. For the original psychedelic explorers, LSD had opened the door to another world and shone an introspective light on the self, both of which provided great insight into what was possible for the self and the species. The original hippies were into enlightenment drugs like marijuana and LSD, not death drugs like alcohol, pharmaceuticals, methadone, and heroin. But after taking one look at what the Haight-Ashbury had devolved into, it was clear that what was true for the initial explorers was not necessarily true for the masses. After many older hippies escaped the horrors of the hate, the street kids, who were left after the summer of love, were into cheap booze, sniffing glue, methadone, and shooting heroin, anything that helped them numb their minds and escape the harsh realities of the failed social experiment. Those who became addicted to heroin invariably resorted to crime to support their habits. The new inhabitants were virtually the exact opposite of the original hippies who were seeking enlightenment and answers. To the original hippies who embraced psychedelics and marijuana, alcohol was a graceless, ignorant, uncool high of the square community. But as the use of psychedelics in the Haight-Ashbury began to wane, alcohol, methamphetamine, and cocaine were on the rise. In 1965, 1966, and the first half of 1967, the crime rate had fallen in the Haight-Ashbury as the peace and love neighborhood was blossoming. But in the final months of 1967, the crime rate climbed sharply, with the year ending with 17 murders, 100 rapes, and almost 3,000 burglaries. With the neighborhood swarming with the burnt out kids with their dead eyes, everyone knew that the crime rate would only get worse. By late 1967, nearly all the old hippies were gone. The free medical clinic had reopened to help treat the growing population of heroin addicts and speed freaks. There had been a mass exodus of hippies moving to communes or farms in Marin County or other rural locations. This significant agrarian movement that created dozens of communes, not only near San Francisco, but in other parts of the country, was interpreted by some that the hippies had given up on social change within the establishment itself and were focusing instead on their own personal lifestyles. If they could focus on their own inner consciousness, they might be able to create small, self sufficient utopian enclaves separated from the crumbling society that they were rejecting. In retrospect, there is one overwhelming truth about the Haight-Ashbury. Even if it was an idealistic venture that was doomed from its beginning, it was not initially the home of ignorance and hedonism as the press portrayed it. Quite to the contrary, the idealistic bohemians that started the Haight were intelligent, socially conscious, with noble intentions. The social issues that the original hippies were facing head on were some of the most serious of their time, and they were simultaneously navigating the uncharted waters of the burgeoning psychedelic revolution. The hippies were not only proactively contending with the war, the drug laws, and an archaic culture, they were also risking their mental health and sanity while seeking answers to the cosmic questions of the universe. The Haight Ashbury was not just a bunch of stoners, it was a heroic cultural revolution. In retrospect, it is easy to see that the Haight Ashbury neighborhood was at the epicenter of the psychedelic revolution, the birth of the hippie movement, and was home to the third great music renaissance in American history. Though the psychedelic revolution had roots as distant and varying as Harvard University, Zihuatanejo, Mexico, Stanford University, Millbrook, New York, and La Honda, California, it was the Haight Ashbury neighborhood where all these tributaries merged into a cultural phenomenon unlike anything experienced before or since. And though the hippie movement of the 1960s and 1970s was experienced across the entire nation and the Western world, it was the Haight Ashbury that gave birth to the movement and saw the largest concentrated population of hippies in the United States. And though rock and roll was a globally popular art form, the Haight Ashbury was a focal point of musical creativity on a scale not experienced since the birth of jazz in New Orleans and the jazz renaissance in Kansas City in the 1920s and 1930s. If you found this subject interesting, then I recommend that you seek out the two companion documentaries, The Psychedelic Revolution of the 1960s and Who Were the Hippies? If you have a passion about this subject and would like to learn more about the rebellious period in American history, then I urge you to seek out my book, Rebellion, a 300-year saga of one family's struggle with authority, the Shays Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, New Orleans, Storyville, Pendergast's Kansas City, the Haight-Ashbury, and beyond.